All right. So hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar with Ocean Networks Canada. My name is Kaylin Correa and I will be moderating this session today. We also have Luisa Sarmiento to help with our interactivity and monitor the chat. And of course we have Meghan Paulson who will be our speaker today. All right. So the aim of this series is to offer free online interactive events featuring ocean-related topics. This series introduces both scientific and Indigenous approaches to understand ocean changes and their importance nowadays. Today's webinar will be about Wiring the Abyss, ONC's fall expedition season, with our wonderful speaker, Meghan Paulson. So now let's see how you can participate in today's session.
So as you can see on the screen, you can participate in Mentimeter. Simply go to menti.com and enter the following code, 509164. So you can do that on your smartphone, use a different browser tab, or download the application Mentimeter. If none of that is possible to you, don't worry, just simply put your answers in the Zoom chat and we'll be here to read them out.
Great, thank you, Louisa. Let's actually try out the Menti. So again, you can go to menti.com and enter 509164. So where are you participating from today? We'll give you a chance to try that out. And that's at menti.com. All right. So where are you participating from? All right, quite a few Victorias, awesome. Lekwungen Territory, Esquimalt Territory, North Saanich, Coast Salish Territory. Oh, we have someone from the Netherlands, Texas, Shawnigan Lake in the chat, awesome. Basin Bay, very cool, okay. Capital Regional District, Vancouver, Burlington. Great, we have people from all over today. It's wonderful to see. Awesome. Great, thank you everyone. So you'll have more opportunities to participate. Great, and now I will introduce Meghan. So as Director of Observatory Digital Operations, Meghan leads the team that ensures accessibility for researchers and the public to all of the data produced by ONC and partner observatories. This is done through continuous monitoring, qualifying and archiving data, assessing the quality control of data being produced, and creating data products to support researchers in visualizing and interpreting the data. So prior to joining ONC in the spring of 2020, Meghan spent over 20 years working in the energy industry in engineering and management roles. The energy industry projects included onshore and offshore projects in the US and internationally. In addition to the energy industry, Meghan has been involved in scientific drilling expeditions, including Ocean Drilling Program and the Lake Malawi Drilling Project. Meghan holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Civil Engineering from Dalhousie University and a Master of Science in Ocean Engineering from the University of Rhode Island. And with that, I'll let you take it away, Meghan.
Thank you very much, and I will share my screen here. So before we get started, at ONC, we always thank our host nations. We acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen people on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. So they asked me to put in a little bit about myself before we get into the presentation. I grew up on the east coast of Canada in New Brunswick. I'm the middle of three sisters. You can see us here smiling. Interesting thing about that is we all ended up being engineers. I have spent a long time playing the beautiful game. Soccer is a bit of a passion, although these days it seems to be played in slow motion when I'm on the field. I look forward to getting back to it post-COVID. And I'm a pretty avid cyclist as well. And I recently, with some friends, built a bicycle from all junkyard parts, which was a bit of a test of my engineering skills and philosophy as well. But it was good fun. So a little bit of a roadmap to follow along with the talk. To set the stage, I'll talk first a little bit about maintaining and growing cabled observatories and what we mean when we talk about cabled observatories. Then I'll get into our 2020 fall expeditions, some highlights from the expeditions, talk a little bit about some opportunistic science sampling that we were able to do on one of the expeditions, and then where we're going next. So now another Menti moment for Louisa.
Awesome. So once again, you can go to www.menti.com and enter 509164. So this question, what is the longest that you have been offshore? All right, 1 week, but it was vacation.
Somebody went on a cruise.
Wow. 6 weeks, 1 month, 94 days, 12 hours, 1 week on a cruise, 20 days, 3 days, never. Interesting.
I think the winner is 94 days. That sure beats my record of 63.
I think so. 25 days up to the Amazon. Great, Megan. Thanks.
So before we get started talking about the expeditions, I thought it would be helpful to talk about what is a cabled observatory exactly. So Ocean Networks Canada operates cabled observatories off the west coast of British Columbia. And what we mean when we talk about a cabled observatory is it's a network of scientific instruments that are placed under the water, and they're placed under there for long-term installations, for long-term measurements and long-term monitoring. And these instruments, what's pretty unique about them compared to a lot of scientific sampling that happens around the world, is these instruments are cabled through a network. And what that means is we have cables that leave a shore station, and they travel across the seafloor. They hook into what we call these nodes. And from the nodes, the cable either continues, or we have some offshoot cables that power instruments. So these instruments are continuously powered through the cables, and they're also able to send data in real time back to the shore station. So we don't have any waiting time to get the data. And from there, the data is archived and available through an online database that anyone can access. So that's our cabled observatory. And these cabled observatories have been in operation for quite a number of years. And so every year we have to do a bit of maintenance. And what we mean by maintenance is both preventative maintenance, meaning calibrating instruments, cleaning instruments, dealing with corrosion. If you think about all of this equipment sitting on the bottom of the seafloor, it's feeling some pretty extreme temperatures and pretty extreme salt water. And sometimes we have to get a little bit creative with our cleaning systems. If you are watching the video, what we have is the arm of a remotely operated vehicle cleaning a sonar bell with what we call our T-Boss, or our toilet brush of science. So the maintenance part and the cleaning of instruments is maybe not the most glamorous part of the job, but it's certainly necessary to make sure that the instruments are all performing as advertised. Some other things that we do on these expeditions is we do upgrades to the instruments, whether it's new technology or upgrades to software or firmware. We grow the network, so we're introducing new experiments and new instruments to support the science community. And we also remove old instruments that have sort of run their course, and the scientific objective is complete for those instruments. So what happens when we actually go offshore for these expeditions is we've got a ship, and on the ship is a remotely operated vehicle, or an ROV. And what an ROV is basically an underwater robot. And that robot has some manipulator arms, as you could see in the last video, that does our maintenance and our installation tasks for us, because at depths of over 2,000 meters sometimes, we as people can't really survive down there. So we send our robots down, and the ROV is tethered to the ship. And so as the ROV is working, it is sending us real-time video to the ship. So we're able to watch exactly what the ROV is doing, and we're able to communicate with the ROV, basically telling it where to move its arms, how to grab hold of things, and where to travel. There's a whole team on board the ship, both a team that are dealing specifically with the remotely operated vehicle, a pilot, a navigator, a video specialist, and then there's the science team that are giving instructions, because the science team are the ones that are deciding what work needs to be done and how it should be done. So this team is on the ship, and all of the video data and all of the audio data from communications on the ship is shared via satellite to our shore base. And we have a team on the shore who is also supporting the expedition, doing things like dive logging, so logging everything that happens during the dive, communicating with our observatory systems specialists, who are there on standby to turn the power on and off to instruments. So some of the maintenance involves plugging and unplugging instruments, and we need to turn the power off before we do that, so we don't cause any issues. And the team on the shore is also communicating with our scientists who are interested in the instruments and the data that the instruments are providing. So if we're installing a new instrument or a new experiment, we're communicating directly with the scientists to get their guidance in terms of where the best placement is, and making sure that that we're setting things up so that they're able to achieve their scientific goals. What we're also doing, both during the expedition and after the instruments are brought online, is all of the data from the instruments and all of the video from the expeditions is being archived in our database called Oceans 2.0. And this is the data that is available to everyone and anyone simply by going online through our website, oceannetworks.ca. So we operate in an open data policy so that anyone who's interested in the data, whether you're a scientist, a citizen, or an educator, is able to access it and able to make some informed decisions. So let's get into our fall expeditions. But first, we're going to have another Menti moment.
Awesome. Okay, this is a fun one. So if you were out at sea for 2 weeks, what would you bring? Again, you can go to menti.com and enter 509164. All right, puzzles. Leonardo DiCaprio. Wine, books, movies, your phone, definitely. Cribbage, chocolate, Dr. Pepper. This is, oh, some gravel.
Gravel's a good one. It can get rough out there.
What would you bring, Megan?
Well, I'm on board with whoever said chocolate. And I also always try to bring shower shoes because the showers can be a little bit gross.
Perfect. Take a few more moments. Cake, bread, wine, a raincoat, some ginger chews. Yeah.
Cake bread, somebody likes good wine.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
All right. I'd sail with any of you. Any of you, you seem well prepared. So where did we go this fall? Here's a map of the world, and we're in Canada and we're on the west coast. So we're going to zoom in to Vancouver Island right here. So here's Vancouver Island, and off the coast of Vancouver Island is one of our cabled observatories that we call the Neptune Observatory. We have another observatory inland called our Venus Observatory. So the fall expeditions focused mainly on these observatories. We did visit a few other spots that I'll talk about a little bit. And we visited some other spots where we have some instruments that are not attached to the cabled observatory, some autonomous instruments. So in the Neptune Observatory, we have a number of specific sites, and each of these squares right here represents a node that we talked about earlier. So we visited most of the sites, not all of them, but most of them, to do maintenance and to deploy some new instruments. I also wanted to point out the cable of our Neptune Observatory comes into a shore station at Port Alberni, and here we are in Victoria, at the University of Victoria. And we have another office slash shop, the Marine Technology Center, which is north of us near the airport in Sydney. And our expeditions left from the iOS dock right across from our Marine Technology Center, just to give you an idea of where we're at. So 2020 has been a pretty interesting year for everyone, and that includes us at ONC, and due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we had to do things a little bit differently this year. It certainly had an impact on our operations. It was pretty uncharted waters for all of us, as it has been for all of you, I'm sure, who've had to adjust with the way we work and the way we live. So some of the things that had to change for us to be able to continue with our expeditions was dealing with COVID-19. And that included, for one of the expeditions, quarantining for 14 days before embarking on the ship, having negative COVID tests before getting on the ship, wearing masks all the time on the ship, except for when we were eating or sleeping. This is me right here on the Nautilus. And because of the pandemic, we were required to not bring as many people out on the ships as we normally would in a normal year. So we did have to push some of our support activities into remote support. And so we had a more remote support set up here in our building on the University of Victoria campus. The pandemic also had an impact on our scheduling. So some activities were delayed and things had to be shuffled around a little bit. So we had to be quite nimble, and our folks in the physical operations division did a great job managing all of that this year. So before we actually go out on an expedition, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in planning and testing and loading. And this is the kind of work that we're basically doing year round. So I'm showing an image to show what kind of detailed planning we do year round. So what you're seeing on the left here is what we call a site layout diagram. And it basically is a drawing of all of the equipment at a particular site that is on the seafloor. So if I zoom in here, this is what we call a junction box. This is junction box 19. And you can see all of these cables plugged into the junction box. So this is where the cables are getting their power from, and all of these cables are running off to various instruments. And it's important to have this information with us, both in planning the expeditions and while we're on the ship and on the shore supporting the expeditions, because it can get pretty confusing down there. Things are dark, there's lots of cables happening, there's lots of instruments, but if you can see from the diagram, and this was a pre-expedition diagram, and then when we actually got down to this site in Clayoquot Slope, it looks pretty remarkably like the diagram looked at. So we knew exactly which cable was plugged into which connector, and where each of these cables traveled to and which instrument it was related to. So this makes our expeditions a lot more efficient, and it makes planning the expeditions a lot more efficient. And after every expedition, a lot of work is put into updating things like the site layout diagrams, among other important metadata. So every instrument that we bring out with us also needs to be set up properly. We need to write drivers for it. We need to be able to understand what kind of data the instrument is producing. We need to be able to have that ready, and we need to make sure that every instrument is tested before we bring it out to sea. So these are some images from our Marine Technology Center, where the team is working pretty hard at building these instruments, building these platforms, and making sure that everything gets tested before it goes out to sea. There's a test tank there, you saw in one of the images. And so each instrument gets dipped into the test tank and gets tested, and we make sure that we're able to talk to it, we're able to get data from it, and that it's acting appropriately and calibrated before we take it off to sea. And then there's the big job of loading everything onto the ship. And this takes a lot of planning as well. There's a limited amount of room and a limited amount of deck space, so we need to plan things accordingly. So the fall expeditions, there were 2 expeditions, and the first one was on the exploration vessel Nautilus from September 4th to the 18th, and this is the expedition that I sailed on. And you'll notice that the next expedition happened just 3 days after we got back from sailing on the Nautilus. Well, this wasn't the original plan for the 2020 fall expeditions, but this was the COVID plan. Like I mentioned, a few things had to get shuffled around due to the pandemic. And so it was a very busy fall with basically back-to-back expeditions. So the goal of the Nautilus expedition was really focused on science, maintenance, and the deployment of new instruments. And to give you an idea, 7 Ocean Networks Canada staff sailed on the Nautilus, in addition to the Nautilus crew and the remotely operated vehicle crew. But typically on this type of expedition, we would send a contingent of 11 staff. The Nautilus ship comes with its own set of remotely operated vehicles, the Hercules and Argus, and I'll talk about those a little bit next. And this expedition this was, I think, our 5th year in a row, partnering with Ocean Exploration Trust on sailing on the Nautilus. So you might be wondering why we split up our expeditions into different ships and different vehicles, and why we go out multiple times. Well, I mentioned loading the ships is a challenge because there's limited deck space. So if we have a lot of equipment that we need to bring out there, we have to break it up so that we have room for everything. But also the vehicles that we use are geared a little bit differently. So on the Nautilus, it's a tandem ROV system. So there's two ROVs, the Hercules, which you can see here on the left, and that's the main ROV. And then Argus, which is the accompanying ROV. So Hercules has two manipulator arms, and it's pretty capable of doing some pretty intricate tasks. It was Hercules that you saw operating the toilet brush of science earlier in the video. And the Hercules-Argus combination is really well suited for taking physical samples that we did quite a bit of in this science-oriented expedition. So why do we have two ROVs on this ship? Well, Argus doesn't have any manipulator arms, but what it does is it gives a bird's eye view of what Hercules is doing. So these are some images from the Endeavour field and some of the hydrothermal vents that occur there. And if you look at the image on the left, this is the image that we're getting from the camera on the Hercules remotely operated vehicle. And it's pretty stunning. The cameras on Hercules are amazing, and it gives us amazing detail. But what it doesn't give us is an idea of what's on the side of us or what's behind us. In these kinds of environments, you have to be very careful so that you don't bang into things, basically. With Argus tethered to Hercules and sailing a little bit above Hercules, you can see in the image on the right side of your screen, Argus is watching what Hercules is doing. And you can see from this vantage point that these hydrothermal vents are kind of all around Hercules. So we know we definitely don't want to move to the right and disturb and possibly damage the ROV in this case. So it's a pretty helpful system for giving us that bigger picture of what's going on offshore. Our second expedition was on the Canadian Coast Guard ship, the John P. Tully, and this was from September 21st to October 6th. And this expedition had a focus both on our inshore observatory and our offshore observatory. The focus for this was maintenance, heavy lift, and instrument deployment. So the ROV system on the Tully is a different system than what we had on the Nautilus, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. On this expedition, we had a sailing contingent of only 2 Ocean Networks Canada staff versus where we would typically send 8 on board, and this was due to COVID restrictions. The remotely operated vehicle on the Tully is a third-party vehicle from Pelagic Research Services, Odysseus. And this remotely operated vehicle isn't always with the Tully. So it can be trucked anywhere or shipped anywhere and can operate on multiple different ships. Whenever we sail on the Tully, it's in partnership with Natural Resources Canada. So the remotely operated vehicle that we used on the Tully is, like I said, not ship specific. And it is geared towards doing some heavy lift activities, where the Hercules is more suited to more intricate operations. If we have some instruments that we need to deploy or recover that are quite heavy, then this is our vehicle of choice. And it can operate into water depths of 6,000 meters, although we don't get quite that deep at our observatory. So here's another Menti moment for you.
Great. So again, you can go to menti.com and enter 509164. So a remotely operated vehicle ROV dives to a depth of 3 kilometers. Guess how long it takes the ROV to reach the bottom. So how fast do they travel? So this is a scale. We have no time at all on the left with 0 minutes, and then we have up to 300 minutes. Interesting. Okay, around 190 minutes. Someone's guessing 45 minutes in the chat. kind of looking in the middle, I guess, around 160 right now. Yep, kind of staying in the center.
We've got a few speed demons there, going off to the left.
40 minutes in the chat. Okay. What do we think, Megan?
Well, the answer is kind of it depends. So sometimes when we're diving with the ROV, we do so at a controlled speed. And when we do that, the reason that we're going at a controlled speed is because we're doing what's called a vertical transect, and we're taking video from the remotely operated vehicle all the way down to the seafloor. So if we did that in 3,000 meters of water, we typically do those at 10 meters per minute. So that would take about 5 hours. That would be a long way down. Now, depending on how loaded up the remotely operated vehicle is with equipment, so how heavy it is, it can make some pretty good time. A pretty quick descent would be 40 meters per minute, which would put us down there in about an hour and a quarter. All right, so let's get into some of the expedition's highlights. So the first highlight that we'll talk about happened on the EV Nautilus, and this happened at Cascadia Basin over here on our Neptune Observatory. And so at Ocean Networks Canada, we have a number of instruments offshore. In this case, these are bottom pressure recorders. And at this particular site, we had 3 bottom pressure recorders all cabled in. And we had a 4th bottom pressure recorder that was waiting on a cable. So we deployed the cable and we deployed the bottom pressure recorder, which basically completed this array of bottom pressure recorders. Now, why is this important and interesting? So this project has been going on since about 2012. There were initially some issues with the cable that was deployed, which was a fiber optic cable, and the fiber optic basically it was very fragile and broke. So there were issues with communications with the bottom pressure recorders. So some of the team at the Marine Technology Center came up with a great idea, and instead of communicating through the fiber optic cables, they communicated through the copper wire that was part of this cable. So it took a little while to sort that out. And on the Nautilus, we finally laid the final cable. You can see it here in orange on a drum the cable lay was starting. And this completed the array of bottom pressure recorders. And what the bottom pressure recorders are doing is they detect real small changes in water pressure, which will measure the wave height of a tsunami wave. And having them in an array gives us the ability to understand the direction that the tsunami wave is traveling in, the speed that it's traveling, and better understand how tsunami waves propagate. And because we have this system offshore, then we get a real sort of early indication of a tsunami wave that could be headed our way on Vancouver Island. So what you see in these images is this green sort of basket right here with some cables on it. That is one end of the orange cable, and it converts into another cable that was brought down to the seafloor. So after running 19 kilometers of cable off of the Nautilus ship, which is the first time that it's been done in this manner, we were able to find the beginning of the cable, and we were able to plug it into our junction box and communicate with this final bottom pressure recorder of our tsunami array. So that was certainly a highlight from the Nautilus cruise. It was pretty exciting for everyone on board and for the science community as well. So our next highlight is kind of a dramatic story. we were able to recover an instrument that had been lost about a year ago. So we're moving into our inland waters here, to our Venus Observatory, so sort of between Vancouver Island and the mainland. And this is our Venus cabled, and sort of at the end of the cable was an instrument called a Delta Dynamics Laboratory. And it was lost in December of 2019, so nearly a year ago. And we knew it was lost because it stopped communicating. And what happened was it got caught up on a ship and got dragged away from its original location, which was right about here. And it got dragged about 400 meters away. Now, we didn't know exactly where it ended up. And this instrument is located at the mouth of the Fraser River. And it's an experiment with Natural Resources Canada where they're looking at large sediment flows or turbidity currents coming from the Fraser River. And they were very interested in recovering this, this lost DDL. So some mapping was done earlier in the summer, and some additional mapping was done later in the summer with some potential targets of where the lost DDL might be found. And sure enough, once we dove on this first potential target, which was about 400 meters away from where it had been placed originally, the ROV was able to see, and you can see this in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, was able to see the instrument. Now, it wasn't sitting exactly upright, but the team offshore was able to latch to it and recover it, and now it's being worked on and fixed up in order to be redeployed next year. So that was a pretty exciting find as well, kind of like treasure hunters out there. And finally, we're going to go back to the Cascadia Basin where deployment occurred, and this is a new instrument called the Straw-B. And it's a follow-up experiment to a straw deployment that was done a couple years ago. And what this is, there's a lot happening on this slide, but it's basically building the case and technology to install a neutrino observatory in the ocean. And the neutrino observatory eventually would be there to study the origin of the universe. Now, don't ask me too much about neutrinos. I'm not a particle physicist. But this installment was building on the previous installment of the original straw in 2018. And this is what it looked like, sort of all wrapped up on the deck of the ship. It's a 500-meter long electrical optical cable with 10 modules. And it's an experiment in partnership with the Technical University of Munich. So here's the team on board the Tully ship deploying the experiment. And here is a visual inspection of one of the modules with the ROV. So we were able to deploy it, plug it in, and communicate with it during the Tully expedition. And now I'll just talk briefly about some opportunistic science sampling that we were able to do on the Nautilus. First, let's have another Menti moment.
Great, thank you, Megan. Okay, so once again, go to menti.com and enter 509164. So what do you think the temperature is at the bottom of the ocean? We have -10, 2 to 5 degrees Celsius, 40 to 50 degrees, and 300 to 350 degrees. Okay, quite a few of you are saying 2 to 5 degrees Celsius. And we've got some on either end there. Mostly still with the 2 to 5, interesting. Okay, a few more with 300 to 350 degrees. What is the temperature at the bottom of the ocean? Looks like we have the majority with yes. Also depends whether it's a hydrothermal site or not. Interesting, that's a comment in the chat.
Yeah, that's a great comment because it was a little bit of a trick question.
All right, Megan, why don't you fill us in?
Sure. So you're exactly right. And most of the time on the bottom of the ocean, it is in the neighborhood of 2 to 5 degrees Celsius. There are a few spots, and at our Endeavour location off the Neptune Observatory, we do run into these hydrothermal vents. And the temperature of the fluid coming out of these hydrothermal vents is in the neighborhood of 300 to 350 degrees Celsius. So if you think about how hot that is, we boil water at 100 degrees Celsius, and you think of all of our instruments on the seafloor and all of our cables, you can kind of understand why we have to do quite a bit of maintenance. The video that you're looking at is from some of the hydrothermal vents at the Endeavour field. And as we zoom in, you can almost see the heat coming out of the vent. And so one of the reasons that the vents are so interesting is there's quite a lot of life living on and around the vents. So during the Nautilus expedition, we were able to recover some live organisms from this area, not right at the vents, but a little bit off the vents. And so we recovered some live sponges that were kind of living at the periphery of the hydrothermal vents. And how we recovered them, if you look at this image, is we have a suction arm on the remotely operated vehicle, and we just sort of suck it up off of the rock that it's been living in. The image on the right is taking the sample jars off of the remotely operated vehicle to then sample the sponge. And the sponge in the lab, you can see on the bottom of your screen. And this particular sponge will eventually be sent over to the Royal BC Museum. So maybe you'll be able to go take a look at it. Another pretty interesting site that we visited was in the Clayoquot area, was a site that we'd been to before. It was a known whale fall site where we think it's been there for about 20 years. It's at a water depth of almost 1,300 meters. This whale skeleton was originally found by a group with the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, or MBARI, in 2009. Ocean Networks Canada visited in 2012 and 2013, and we visited again this year in 2020. And we were able to recover a sample of whale vertebrae, which was covered in some microbial mat and a few critters living on it and feeding it. And it was pretty slimy and pretty stinky. So everyone that came into the lab to have a look didn't stick around too long. And the importance of recovering this is to be able to study the different organisms that feed on these originally whale carcasses and then whale skeletons. They're providing a lot of food for the underwater world for a long time. Like I said, it's been about 20 years. And then the final set of opportunistic samples that I'll mention today is some sediment cores. And we collected sediment from a number of sites around the Neptune Observatory. And what you're seeing here is the arm of the remotely operated vehicle plunging these tubes into the sediment and then pulling them back out. And on the right, you can see the sediment in the tube in the laboratory. So you get an idea of the difference in sediment depending on how long it's been down there. And this sediment was taken for two different reasons, both for baseline sampling, one for environmental DNA studies, and one to study microplastics. So by sampling here now, we basically get a baseline for each of those. And as we return to these same sites in future, we can monitor how things change over time. So just one other mention. Sometimes the seas get pretty rough to dive with the ROV. As you saw, it's tethered to the ship. And when the seas are quite rough, we're unable to dive safely. But we try to spend our time wisely. And on the Nautilus, we had some rough seas for a few days. And so rather than just bobbing around, we used that time to do some what we call multi-beam mapping. So we're basically mapping the seafloor and taking with a sound-based multi-beam imaging system. And so we create these images of the seafloor. In this case, it was in West Valley, which is a site that we haven't explored very much in the past, but these images and this bathymetry of the area will make some future expeditions to this area a lot easier to plan and a lot more interesting, so that you know exactly sort of where to dive with your ROV to find the most interesting features. And then finally, what's next? Well, our fall expedition season is mostly over, but we have one more expedition that we're planning in the next couple weeks to visit the Barkley Canyon area of our Neptune Observatory. And this expedition will be a short one, and it's entirely to replace one of the nodes that's at Barkley Canyon that had an issue with it and has been offline for quite a number of months. So that'll be a 2-ship operation. So we'll lower down a refurbished node and pull the current node out of the water and plug the new node back in. And hopefully all of the instruments connected downstream of it will come back to life. And then we have a very busy 2021 planned already as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Megan. Fascinating to learn about all of the deep sea expedition. Great. So now we will be having our question period, but these are the links that you can refer back to that Megan has used in her presentation, and we will be sending them out in a post-event email if you're interested. So keep an eye out for that. Okay, and I would like to remind you all that we do have 2 more webinars coming up. So our next one is 2 weeks from now with Mauricio on the importance of community observatories for coastal ecological studies. And our last one is in December with Kristen on the impacts of underwater noise on marine life. So please join us for those. Awesome. So as always, you can connect with Ocean Networks Canada. We have a wonderful website with tons of information. Also our ocean data portal, Oceans 2.0. You can follow us on social media, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And you can always email us at learning@oceannetworks.ca. So a big thank you to our funders. Ocean Networks Canada is funded by the Canada Foundation for Innovation, the Government of Canada, Natural Resources Canada, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, CANARI, the Government of British Columbia, the University of Victoria, and many others. Okay, and with that, we will begin our question period. So for those leaving us, please make sure to fill out the post-event satisfaction survey, which Louisa will put in the chat right now. And we also have Kim Juniper joining us for the question period. Kim is the Chief Scientist at Ocean Networks Canada. He has been a professor in the School of Earth and Ocean Sciences and the Department of Biology at the University of Victoria, and the holder of the BC Leadership Chair in Ocean Ecosystems and Global Change since 2006. So hello, Kim, and thanks for joining us. All right, so you can go to Menti again and get your questions in there. Okay, so the first question I believe has been answered in the chat. How can we watch the Endeavour dive from a Mexican public ocean science institution?
Sure. So all of the dives we archive in Oceans 2.0 that Kaylin shared a link to. And in the Oceans 2.0 portal, there's a system called CTube. And if you go on CTube, you can watch the dives and you can actually search for anything interesting. If you're really interested in, say, octopus sightings, you can type in the word octopus and that'll bring you to the part of the video where octopus have been sighted. At Endeavour, you might be interested in the hydrothermal vents, so just type in vents and it'll bring you right to that part of the video.
Perfect. Okay, so who designs or makes the ROVs or AUVs? So Kim answered this in the chat. So Kim, do you want to maybe share briefly?
Sure. So science is actually benefiting from ROVs that were developed for the offshore oil industry to, in many ways, to replace commercial divers as we went deeper in exploiting offshore oil. And science has benefited from this technology. And there was only a small number of scientific ROVs available around the world. Most of them tend to be built in-house by engineers and technicians in the institutions that operate them, but some are modified commercial vehicles.
Awesome, thank you, Kim. So we'll get back to our Menti questions. We have quite a few and not too much time. So what is your favorite expedition moment? Megan, I think this one's for you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say on the Nautilus, one of my favorite moments was retrieving the whalebone. It was pretty unusual and pretty interesting as well. Particularly being an engineer and not being a biologist, just seeing with my own eyes all the life that is occurring on the whalebone was pretty fascinating.
Awesome. Okay, so another question. What species of bacteria were you able to identify from the microbial mat?
Oh, that's a Kim question for sure.
Yeah, I've identified that in the chat as well, but let's just go over it. Most bacterial mats tend to be created by what are called sulfur oxidizing bacteria. These are bacteria that use hydrogen sulfide as a fuel, as an energy source. And they create these filamentous mats, but that also creates habitat for a whole host of other different bacteria. So it's almost like a giant biofilm, and where there's a huge amount of diversity in them. The first time that my lab has ever collected them, we expected to find a monoculture, and it turned out that it's far from it. There's a lot of different things in there that take advantage of this habitat that's created by the filaments in the mat.
Wonderful. So how was life on the ship, Megan? Could you have group gatherings?
So not the same kind of group gatherings that would be typical in pre-COVID times. The only group gatherings were really during meal times because there were set meal times. And so if you wanted to eat, you had to eat at that time. But we were kind of spread out during meal times even. So it was a bit more strange than a typical expedition for sure.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, another question. Do you work with private telecommunications companies for designing or laying cables?
We do, yeah. So the cable system at Neptune was in conjunction with Alcatel from out of France. So we don't manufacture any of that equipment ourselves, and although we do have some expertise in-house, but we do rely on commercial providers of cables.
Okay, and I'll ask one from the chat here. So thanks for the great presentation, Megan. I represent RBR Ltd. We make the bottom pressure recorders that are used in the Cable Observatory. Can you talk more about the importance of industry and ONC's supply chain to your mission?
Sure, yeah, it's critical really. So most of the instruments that we deployed are provided by instrument companies, and we do partner with a number of instrument companies as well to help develop new instruments. We don't at ONC necessarily have the capacity to do all of that ourselves, and the work that's being done by a number of the instrument manufacturers and private companies is wonderful, and you know, they're pretty cutting edge. So we partner with these companies and certainly rely on them as well.
Great. All right, what is the earliest time that your pressure sensors can detect a tsunami relative to catch the coast?
What is the earliest time that your pressure sensors can? Do you want to take that, Kim? I'm not sure I totally understand what they're asking.
Sure, I think that's certainly an interesting question, and it really depends on where the tsunami comes from. If the tsunami comes from what we call a far field tsunami from either the Alaska subduction zone or from Japan, for example, then our outermost bottom pressure recorder at Endeavour would be able to detect it. And looking at the speed that tsunamis travel at, that probably would give us about 20 to 30 minutes warning before it hits the coast, depending on the angle that it's running at. Whereas if the tsunami is generated locally, like in the subduction zone near Vancouver Island, what we call the Cascadia subduction zone, then we're down to very short minutes because of the distance between where the tsunami is actually created and our coast, which is only a few tens of kilometers.
Okay, thank you. Okay, someone is asking, how do I get a job like yours as an engineer?
Yeah, great question. Study hard. For myself, I was very fortunate to have some great co-op work term experiences, which really set the course of my career. Run after what you're interested in, and if someone asks you to do something crazy, like get onto a ship for weeks at a time, say yes. Go for it. Just say yes.
I like that answer. Awesome. Okay, another question. Is ONC recording current and tide characteristics as well? If no, may I know why? They can be used for modeling many ocean characteristics.
Maybe I'll have a go at this one.
Sure.
Yes, we have, in addition to our bottom pressure recorders, we have depth sensors on most of our instrument packages. So when you're monitoring ocean depth, you're also monitoring the coming and going of tides. So we're collecting a lot of information for tides. And also we have a lot of acoustic current meters called Doppler current profilers that allow us to measure current speeds over top of our individual instrument platforms. And in fact, one of our as pressure recorders, the one in the Arctic in Cambridge Bay, has actually been surveyed in by the Canadian Hydrographic Service so that it can actually serve as an official tide gauge. So you need to go to kind of a next level if you really want to have these instruments contributing to an official network of tide gauges, as opposed to just providing data for oceanographers. But it can be done, and it is being done in many cases.
Great. Have you had any problems with marine life interfering with the cables?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say marine life tends to interfere more with the instruments by what we call biofouling, so growing on them, and we have to clean them off periodically. The bigger issues with the cables themselves are like trawling events or things like that, more you know, like a ship interacting with the cable and moving it out of place and sometimes severing it. But the marine life itself is more on the instruments, and it's just because they're living there and growing there, but that can impact the instruments themselves.
Okay. Okay, are ONC tsunami detection systems connected to emergency organizations of BC or federal?
So we do send the data from our bottom pressure recorders to the Alaska Tsunami Warning Center. I mean, that is really the center that issues the official notifications for all of the eastern side of the Pacific Ocean. So they do get the data from our bottom pressure recorders. And that's sort of integrated into their models where they're monitoring earthquakes and pulling in data from other sensors all over the Pacific Ocean.
Okay, great. We have a lot of questions today. This is awesome. Any more in there, Louisa?
So in the Mentimeter, no more. Maybe in the chat?
Let's double check the chat here.
Maybe I'll add something to the question about marine life interfering with cables. During the early years of the transatlantic, particularly telecommunication cables, when we had analog cables rather than fiber optic, you had to transmit a lot of electric current through the cables, and it was found that it was generating a magnetic field under the cables down in the dark, deep sea. And there were some issues with sharks being attracted to this and biting into the cables. But with the change to fiber optics, we're sending less power and more and light through these cables now. So the electrical field the magnetic field that's generated is much smaller. And also Ocean Networks Canada, we bury our cables down to depths beyond which sharks never really go. So our cables are buried in about 1 to 2 meters of sediment after they're laid, our big ones, down to about at least 1,000 meters, sometimes 2,000 meters. And sharks usually don't go down that deep because there's not much for them to eat there.
Okay, great. We have another question. Any plans to deploy new Barbie dolls to the node?
Oh, so someone's been watching some of the C-Tube video. Yeah, so we do try to have a bit of fun on these expeditions as well. There are a few superheroes that are in the waiting room, ready to be deployed. And I guess a little funny story: the previous executive director of operations here at Ocean Networks Canada retired in September, and we had a bobblehead doll made of him that we did deploy at Neptune. So he's down there watching over things for us.
Awesome. Another question, will the 650 nanometer transmissimeter at Yarrow Point in Saanich Inlet be coming back? Not sure if either of you know about that.
Yarrow Point.
Yeah.
Certainly we've had a number of sensors online on a vertical profile in Saanich Inlet that was having winch problems, and yes, we are endeavoring to put it back online.
Great. Okay. So I think that's all for the questions. Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And we hope to see you at the next ones. So enjoy the rest of your day or evening, wherever you are.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.